In this live stream, we'll learn how to add Redux to a React app in TypeScript. Now in this tutorial, I'll be using CodeSandbox to demonstrate this, but feel free to follow along using a command line or terminal. So in my CodeSandbox, I create a sandbox, and then I will be choosing the React TypeScript, which is the official template. So I'm going to click it, and it should start creating one. Cool. So as it's creating, if you're following along using the command line, all you have to do is run npx create react app, your app name, and then -- template TypeScript to bootstrap your create react app. And of course, cd or change directory into the app that you created. Now back to CodeSandbox. It seems that it has been bootstrapped, and you can see that it is because on the right, it shows hello CodeSandbox. Start editing to see some magic happen. And it opens up app.tsx for you. So to get started with Redux, the first thing you'll need to do is install the necessary dependencies. So currently we are using the latest versions, React, React DOM, React Scripts. You can see that there's 17 and React Scripts is on 14 or on 4, my bad. And then we want to add the dependency. So for Redux, we want to actually add Redux Toolkit. And so Redux Toolkit is pretty much redux.js/toolkit. This one. So hit enter, and then it will install version 1.5. And then we will also install React Redux right over here. And since we're also using TypeScript, we also want to install the type definitions, which is on definitely typed. And you may have seen it show up before when we installed React Redux. You'll see that it's @types/React Redux. And you'll see the versions that we've installed here. React Redux is on 7, and @types React Redux is on 7. Cool. So now we've installed it. The first thing we want to do is we want to create our slice. And to create our slice, we go in source, and then we add a new file. And we'll name this file slice.ts. I'm going to close app.tsx, and on slice.ts, so to create our slice, we need to import create slice from Redux Toolkit at redux.js/toolkit. Just like that. And then now we create our slice. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it slice, just to be unoriginal. And then create slice. And we call it, and in it we pass in an object. So the slice, all slices need to have a unique name. So here, let's say we're creating a Redux store for a counter. Another unoriginal example. And so we'll call this the name, give it counter. And then we need to pass it an initial state. So for our really dumb counter, the initial state is that we're gonna have a value, and the value will default to 0. And so now we have name and we have initial state. Then what we want to do is we want to add reducers. So pretty much the reducers field allows us to kind of define reducers and generate associated actions. For those who have used Redux before, it should be pretty familiar. And so in our reducers, let's create 2 fields for it. Let's create an increment as well as a decrement. And so as you can guess from increment, what increment does is it takes a state and then returns a new one where we increment the value by 1. So we'll do state.value ++. And you may notice, hey, you're actually mutating state itself. Isn't that wrong? Well, this is fine because we're using Redux Toolkit, and under the hood, Redux Toolkit uses immer. And the immer library pretty much produces a draft state. so that all changes that look mutable here are actually returning an immutable state based on those changes. And so that's why we can actually mutate the code here and it'll be fine because of the fact that we're using immer. And so let's do the same thing with decrement. And instead of plus plus, we do minus minus. This is the same thing as doing state.value minus equals 1. Cool. So we have those two states. And then finally, what we can do is you can export default slice, or you can export the members or the constants from destructuring slice. And what we want is actions and reducer. Cool. Let me first hide the Explorer here so you can see the whole code here. Excellent. So we save our file. And here we have our slice.ts. And then after that, we want to create our store. So let's create a store. Let's open up the Explorer again. And then let's name our store store.ts. So to configure our store, we'll need to import, as you can guess, configure store. And we want to import it from @redux.js/toolkit. And then we also want to import our reducer from slice that we just created. And so to configure our store, let's create a constant store equals configure store. And once again, we want to call it, and it takes an argument, which is an object, and reducer is the property that we want to set. So here, the key of this reducer is the same as the name we gave in our slice, and that is counter. Just like that. And here, this is technically the counter reducer. So let's do export default for the store here. Great. Now let's save this file. It is saved. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to make the store available to all nested components. And that we create a provider, pass it with the store as the prop, and then put our components underneath. So here, what we can do is we can go into the index.tsx. You'll see already we import render and we have our app, which is rendered in the root element. So we want to import provider from react-redux. Then we want to import our store from store. And we'll go over here. And here we render our provider. This will be kind of the top level, maybe even the root element. And then we pass in our store in here. And then app is going to be in our children. And then we close off provider over here. And let's save it. And you'll see that app is rendered inside of provider. And we can see that on the right, it refreshed. Nothing broke, so everything looks good. Excellent. And so now all we should do is create our component. And just to create a new component that's kind of more clean, what we can do is we'll create a new one. So we're going to delete app. So we're going to rename app to counter. That's what we're going to call our component. So here it's going to be counter as well. here it's counter as well. I'm going to save it. It should break because counter is not found. I'm going to delete app.tsx. And then I'm also going to delete styles.css since that's used by counter, but it's no longer necessary. And then I'm going to save this because it seems like it didn't save. All right, saved. And now I'm going to create counter.tsx. Cool. So in this component, let's do export default function, and this will be counter. That's our component name. We're creating a function component. And then for now, let's just simply render something. Since it's our counter, let's use fragment, and we want to render the count. For now, let's just add a paragraph. There's a hard code of 0 for now. And then I'm going to render 2 buttons. And one of the buttons is going to have a plus, and the other button is going to have a minus. I'm just going to save it. And you can see now we have these. Of course, nothing is happening because we have not attached any of our actions. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to render the state that's from our store. That's from our counter slice store. And so to get the state, we can use useSelector. So we want to import useSelector. So this is a hook provided by react-redux. And then here we can do const, and we grab the count. And then we want to use the useSelector hook. That should be called at the top of the component. And then we have our state. And then from our state, we want to return state.counter.value, because counter is the reducer name and value is the default or the state that we have. I'm going to close the Explorer again, just so it's easier to read and look at. And then instead of the 0 now, let's render a count. So let's save it and see what happens. And you'll see that in our console, okay, so this is a different error, so that should be fine. But if we go down, you'll see that 0 is here, but to make sure that that is rendering correctly, let's go back to our slice. Let's set the default value to 42, and let's see what happens. And you'll see that, boom, it is 42. So we are correctly rendering the value from our store, which is excellent. And the reason why we want to also use useSelector here is because this hook also does a shallow comparison. So as you can see in the description below, it does an optional equality comparison function. And so you can actually use this to optimize the performance to prevent like redundant renders. So it's a performance optimizing trick that can be useful, especially if your store is like listening to events that are changing constantly with a lot of data, like large tables, for example. However, you will notice that, and let me drag this to make this a bit smaller, well, that there is this underline here says property counter does not exist on type DefaultRootState. And so this is a TypeScript warning. We'll fix it. I'll fix it after a bit. For now, let's add the dispatcher so that we can render our actions to increment and decrement the counter. So since we need our actions, let's import actions from the slice that we created. So this is our counter slice. And then let's do const dispatch equals useDispatch. And where does useDispatch come from? It comes from react-redux again. So let's go in here and let's just add it, useDispatch. So we import useDispatch from react-redux. Here now we have the dispatch. And so in our button, let's add an onClick. Let's add an event or callback. And our callback simply does dispatch. And then calling dispatch, we pass in our argument actions dot increment. This increment is the one that we created. And you can see that it shows. So let's save it. Let's wait for it to re-render. And it didn't work because I made a mistake. We also need to call it. So actions.increment returns a function, so you must invoke it. Now, when you hit the plus, let's see. It still didn't increase. It's because I forgot to save. Saving now. Now, when I click it, it works. Cool. And so we can do the same thing in the decrement button below. So let me copy that. And I guess I didn't paste it correctly. It's fine. So let's copy up to here. Great. And so the same thing, dispatch actions. Now this time it's decrement called. Then we save it. And if we hit minus, now it decrements. Great. So to solve this kind of type warning with the any is pretty simple. So our UI is now integrated with Redux using hooks. And so to fix this type error, what we can do is we can type the state. And to type the state, all we need to do is we need to import store from store. And then we can create a type root state. And pretty much that is the return type of store.getState. And so here we can add the type for state, root state over here. And once that's added and we save, you'll see that now it has the type for our counter, which is neat. However, if you see yourself doing this for each and every component, it gets a little redundant. So what's actually recommended, and Redux recommends this as well, is that you should type the hooks. So let's actually go back to our Explorer and let's create in source hooks.ts. And then in hooks.ts, what we want to do is let us copy these two things, paste it here, and then let's also copy this line, paste it here as well. So let's delete useDispatch. We have the import store, which is great. Now we have the type root state. And then let's export constant. And this one, let's call it, following the Redux example, useAppDispatch. You can call it use whatever dispatch, or actually not dispatch here. Let's call it selector, because this is the selector we want to update. And then here, what we can do is we can use actually the typed useSelector hook. And here, this is using the root state as the type assigned to useSelector. And the typed useSelector hook is also imported from react-redux. So instead of typing it all again, let's just copy it, paste it, and let's save it. And then going back into counter, what we can do is we don't need to use the useSelector anymore, but we can import from hooks, and we did an export. So we want to import the member, and that's useAppSelector. And this is from hooks. And now instead of useSelector over here, we do useAppSelector. And you can technically delete root state now. Let's save it, and let's see if there's any type warnings. Now you'll notice that there are none. And you can actually do plus or minus, still works. And if you hover over it, you'll still get your type definitions. And so we can do the same thing actually for dispatch as well. And for dispatch, it's pretty much similar. Here, what we need to do is we need to import useDispatch from react-redux. Then we can create a type, and we'll call this type appDispatch. And this will be type of store.dispatch. And then for the, and similarly to the useAppSelector, we're going to do an export const useAppDispatch, and this will be a callback function. And in the callback function, we will use dispatch, and it will be the type for appDispatch that we add here. And that should be enough. So let's save it. And so these are the two hooks that you can use, which will have the type information for any other new components they use that requires both the dispatch and the selector for the store. And that means we can now actually delete import useDispatch. Actually, before I delete it, all right, let's comment that out. All right, let's delete it again. And then let's do, actually give me 1 second. Things like the CodeSandbox bugged out a little, so I'm gonna refresh real quick, reload. And so pretty much what we're gonna do is we're gonna just replace the useDispatch and the useSelector from react-redux with the hooks that we've created. And this should be used across your application. So as it's refreshing, all right, still taking a while. All right, cool. So now opening up counter.tsx. Great. And then we want to use the useAppDispatch. Oh. All right. Let's see what is CodeSandbox doing. All right, I'm gonna try again, useAppDispatch. Great, so now importing useAppDispatch, which is the hook, custom hook that we created. And let me delete this. And then going to here, useAppDispatch. And let's save it. And let's see it work on the right after it transpiles the modules. All right, let's refresh again. But at this point, dispatch should work. And the great thing about it is now it provides a lot of the type hints that you can use in your IDE, as you can see over here. If you hit plus or minus, it still works as usual, which is excellent. And so that's pretty much the gist of how to add Redux to a React application. This is done in TypeScript. If you're not using TypeScript, you can do it without the extra type hints. So it should be a bit more straightforward. And anything else, I would say that you can continue to make improvements onto your application. But that's pretty much the gist of it. Oh, I think one thing else that I can show is what if, let's say, you're not doing just an increment and decrement, but you want to do some more things. So going back to your counter slice, in here, what we can do is we can actually show an example of in your reducers where, let's say, if you want to increment by a particular value, so increment by amount, for example. And then so here we have the state, and then we have the action. And then this will be a callback function. It'll be state.value. This time we do plus equals action.payload. So how would you write something like this, right? And so for this reducer, to type both the action, what we'll need to do is we'll need to import payload action. So let me just first type this payload action, and we know that this is a number because this is the value. And payload action can be imported from React.js Toolkit. So if you save it here, you can now make use of this. So you have now your increment, your decrement, but you can actually, pass in a particular payload if you want to make, more detailed changes, for example. But I think this is pretty much the gist of a very generalized introduction on how to add Redux to a React app. Feel free to check out this blog post. It goes over kind of the same steps with a bit more details and instructions. And if you want to learn more, you can scroll all the way down under resources. And I also have this GitHub repository that you can check out, which has kind of the similar code. The link to the blog post is in the description below. And here are some other resources. These are the official Create React App templates for Redux, TypeScript Redux. Those are really useful as well. But yeah, this is all for this live stream. I will catch you in the next one. Take care.